We're really excited to bring you this event. My name is Almudena Sevilla. I am a professor of economic and social policy at LSE. I'm also the director of WHISPER, because don't know what it is. It's the Women in Social and Public Policy Research Hub, and it is located at the Social Policy Department. So check out our website if you want to get involved, continuing this conversation. So I'm very pleased to be joined today by my LSE colleagues, Gabriel Leite-Mariante, Jan Orga, and my host too. I'm delighted to welcome back LSE alumna, Dame Maria Taylor, to LSE for this. Okay, so I will probably introduce the speakers shortly, but before I do so, I would like to make the following announcements. So we need to keep our phones quiet, so please put them in silent if you can. The event is also being recorded, and it's a hybrid event. So after the event, our idea is to make both as well as a video. As usual, there will be a chance for you to ask questions. So our presenters are going to present for about 10 minutes each, and then we will have the Q&A session. When you ask a question, if you can say your name and the affiliation, if you're an LSE student, maybe you want to say what department you're in, just so that we know you a little bit better. And the same goes for those who are online. Just type your question in the chat. So this event, what is this event? This event marks the launch of the publication of the new LSE Public Policy Review issue, Multidisciplinary Approaches and Policy Innovation in Gender Research. So this is an issue that I edited, been working on gender issues for a long time. I'm not going to say how long, because when you can work out my age. The LSE Public Policy Review is a new journal. It's an open access journal by LSE Press, and it publishes thematic issues and brings together experts with different interdisciplinary or disciplinary perspectives. On the journal's archive, if you want to have a look, you can see issues around populism, well-being, tax, justice, AR, the war in Ukraine. So a lot of policy relevant issues, but looking at those issues from an academic and sort of like intellectual point of view. So this issue explores how gender inequality remains one of the most persistent and pressing economic challenges today. Policymakers often address gender inequality through fragmented measures. Usually they focus on individual choice rather than structural constraints driving economic disparities. So this issue portrays how recent academic research increasingly supports a shift toward a multidisciplinary and overarching approach, highlighting those barriers, those structures, those cultural forces that sustain inequality. So the work of the authors that we've invited today showcases this approach to understand gender inequalities, and the discussion we will have today will bring to the fore what this approach means for policy. And I'm hoping that Maria can help us with that. You can read the issue online by searching for LSE Public Policy Review on your browser, or scan the QR code that should be in your screens here. Okay, so let me introduce the speakers. I'm going to introduce all of them before we start, and then they can start. So Gabriel Leite-Mariante is a PhD candidate in economics at LSE. He is affiliated with the LSE Hub for Equal Representation in the Economy. The Hub launched in 2022 And he is part of the team that developed the Child Penalty Atlas. He will talk about that, I'm sure. A really interesting project. And he will kick off our discussion today, setting up the foundation by examining gender inequality in the labor market and focusing on the child and marriage penalties. Shani, or God, is professor in the Department of Media and Communications at LSE. She has written extensively on public discourses about gender equality in the workplace and media representations of women at work. Today, she will present insights from her contribution to the LSE issue that we're talking about here today, focusing on how discussions around motherhood and menopause frame women's employment decisions as personal choices rather than structural issues related to workplace and caregiving inequality. Margot, here on my left, is an LSE fellow in the Department of Social Policy, and she's also a member of Whisper. She will share insights of her paper with Caroline Colley, which shows how workplace harassment holds back economic equality and contributes to the exclusion of women from leadership and high-paying roles. And finally, one of the key purposes of this event is discussing the policy implications emerging from today's papers. So we are really delighted and grateful to have with us Dame Maria Miller, who was Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport and Minister for Women and Equalities between 2012 and 2014. And previously, she was also a junior minister in the Department for Work Conventions between 2010 and 2012. She chaired the Women and Equalities Committee from 2015 to 2019. And Maria will hopefully offer a lot of expertise in policy and will comment on the insights from the research papers that will be presented today. Maria is also an LSE alumna from the Department of Economics, so it's great to have her here. Okay, so without further ado, Gabriel, it's your turn.
Hello, Almudena. Is this working okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Almudena, and thanks for all my fellow panelists, and thanks everyone for coming. It's a great pleasure to be here to talk to you today. And I wanted to start this evening, sort of as Almudena said, trying to set the scene a little bit on the some of the recent research done, especially in the field of economics, which is my department, on gender inequality, and in particular on the role of parenthood in contributing to gender inequality, and how does that has been documented around the world, right? So, so I think that the main fact that is motivating all the research that a lot of us do in terms of gender inequality in the labor market is the fact that there is a lot of gender inequality in the labor market, right? And this map here shows by how much the employment rate of men and women is different around the world, right? So you can see that in some countries, the difference in employment rates is very high. It's up to as high as 90%. Here I'm just subtracting the employment rate of men from the employment rate of women. Whereas in other countries, it's much lower. It's 5, 10, 15%. It's never zero. It's never negative. There's nowhere in the world where the difference is the other way around. Right. So this is a pattern that we see in pretty much every single country in the world. Right. Women are more likely to be in employment than men. Now, a lot of the recent research has empirically shown that one big event in people's lives that is one of the drivers of this inequality is parenthood, the arrival of a child. Right. So in the UK, this graph here that I'm showing you shows what happens on the probability of being in employment of mothers and fathers around the time in which they have their first child using data from the UK, right? So what we're doing here is we're comparing the trajectory in terms of probability of being employed of men and women before and after they have first child. And we can see that for men, what happens is nothing, basically. The employment trajectory continues to be very flat and constant around the time of the first childbirth. Whereas women see a very clear decline in the first year, very steep, that sort of picks up to some extent after 1 year. And then very, very, very crucially, it's a decline that keeps existing even after as much as 10 years, right? So if you look at the difference in the probability of employment between fathers and mothers 10 years after first childbirth, it's big, right? The difference is quite substantial. So on average in the UK, if you take an average of the 10 years after childbirth, mothers are 33% less likely to be in employment compared to fathers. Now, is this something that only happens in the UK? Is this a UK specific issue that mothers drop out of the labor force and fathers don't? It's not. If you look at other countries in the world, we see graphs that look to some extent similar to the one in the UK. I'm showing you here a few examples. The United States, France, and Germany are sort of wealthier nations, what some would call more developed countries. Much like the UK, they have a child penalty that's substantial. In Germany, it's more than 40%. In the US and France, it's about 25, 26%. In countries beyond sort of like the global north or the Western world or whatever you call it, such as Brazil and Latin America, Kenya and Africa and Bangladesh and South Asia, the child penalty exists and the picture looks similar. The magnitude is different. In Bangladesh, it's one of the largest in the world. In Kenya, it's much smaller. In Brazil, it's kind of intermediate. But the difference, the sort of like the conclusion is, no matter where we look, this pattern persists. Fathers seem to have no measurable impact in terms of their trajectories after the arrival of a child, and mothers have a strong decline and a decline that does not sort of recover in the long run. So to that phenomenon, that sort of that empirical relationship, a lot of research has been done, and to that phenomenon, the name has been given the name of the child penalty or the motherhood penalty. You can also see that called the motherhood penalty. Right. So as Almudena mentioned, we've worked together with a group of people that are, I should have mentioned in the beginning, actually, Camille Landé here at the LSE, Sveva Manfredi also here at the LSE, Henry Clevin at Princeton University. We've done a lot of work in terms of gathering data for countries around the world to try and quantify the role of children in driving inequality in employment in as many countries as possible. And we created what we call the Child Penalty Atlas. And here I'm showing you a graph that looks a little bit like the first graph that I showed you, except instead of showing you what is the gender gap in employment between men and women, I'm showing you by how much does the birth of a first child impact the career of mothers more than that of fathers. And again, similar to the first graph, there is no country in the world where this penalty is negative, as in it affects fathers more than mothers. That doesn't exist. And it's very significant, right? In some parts of the world, the child penalty is as big as between 43 and 64%. For example, in Latin America, it's very high. In some countries of North Africa and Central Asia, and a little bit of Western Europe as well. Whereas in other countries, it's much lower. It's between, in some countries, we don't actually measure a child penalty that's substantially different from zero, or we measure some much smaller numbers. So the child penalty is an important quantity that measures by how much sort of the gender gap. We're looking here at employment, but we could do the same exercise for things like earnings, income, hours worked, any sort of economic labor market measure. But it's of course not the whole story, right? There can be a world, for example, in which there are other factors that contribute to the gender gap that are not related to the child penalty. If you think of a hypothetical scenario where women are completely excluded from the labor market, independent of whether they have a child or not, the child penalty is zero, because the effect of having a child would be like children would not be the ones that would be determining this gender gap. So one sort of like the next step in the quantification of the child penalty is to sort of try to understand how much of the total gap we see in the world we can attribute to this child penalty. So we can take the gender gap in employment and separate that into a gender gap that we can quantify as being due to the arrival of the first child, and the rest of the gender gap that is due to factors that are unrelated to having a first child that predate perhaps having a first child, right? So when you do this exercise and you plot by how much we can explain the total gender gap versus a measure of income, which here I'm using log GDP per capita, but you could use other measures if you wanted, but it's going to look very much the same. We see a picture that I think is quite interesting and quite telling as well, in terms of teaching us something about how economic development is associated with the different causes of the gender gap in employment, right? So for countries with the lowest levels of GDP per capita, you have a sizable gender gap in employment, but the child penalty is very small. So most of this gap is explained by something that is not related necessarily to children, at least that does not come after the birth of the first child. As GDP per capita increases and we go towards middle income countries, a lot of Latin America, a lot of North Africa, and Middle East are here, the child penalty starts to appear. The rest of the gender gap does not shrink. So as a result, you have the highest gender gaps in the world because you have a sizable chunk due to the child penalty and another sizable chunk that's due to other factors that are not related to the child penalty. As we move towards the right of this graph, towards high-income countries such as the UK, all of Western Europe, the United States, Australia, what we see is that the child penalty does not really disappear. It's still here. But the rest of the gender gap starts to shrink to the extent that in the highest, in the richest countries, the richest economies in the world, the child penalty explains the entirety of the gender gap. It really does seem to be the case that the gender gap in employment, more than a gender gap, is a gap between mothers and everyone else in the economy. We can explain about 100% of the gender gap in the UK, in Western Europe, in Scandinavia, with the child penalty. Now, of course, when we look at this graph, we're like, okay, there's still a lot of things that we don't know here that we're just going with the blue graph. There's many other factors that might be related to gender gaps that are not necessarily come after the birth of a first child. So the next step that we do in this agenda is to look at one other important potential factor that might be driving gender inequality, which is marriage, right? So how much of this, in addition to the child penalty, how much could we attribute to marriage, which in several parts of the world is also related to family formation, and we see when we look in our data across different countries that marriage and parenthood are correlated in many parts of the world. Now, if we can do the same exercise for child penalty, but add here sort of a marriage penalty, if you will. And what we see here is that at countries with very low income per capita, we can explain a slightly larger chunk of the gender gap with a marriage penalty. This marriage-related gap, it's kind of constant, and then it eventually starts to shrink. And in wealthy nations like Western Europe, the UK, Scandinavia, Australia, there is no marriage penalty. Marriage, in terms of the impact on employment, is either a non-event or has a very small impact, right? So we can sort of split our total gender gap in a chunk that's related to marriage, a chunk that's related to children, and things that are unexplained by these two variables. Okay. Now, of course, as I've shown you here previously, the child penalty is everywhere to some extent, but it shows up in very different magnitudes, right? In Germany, for example, it's much bigger than in France. In Bangladesh, it's much bigger than in Kenya. In Brazil, in the United States, and in the UK, it's somewhere in the middle. Why? Why is that? Well, how can we explain such differences? And I think that here is where sort of a lot of the recent research is trying to push forward and sort of help us understand a little bit better. Why is it that the effect of children on the labor market is at the same time similar insofar as qualitatively similar? It's always unidirectional. It's always the case that women are the ones who are bearing the vast majority of this burden, but the extent to which this is true varies a lot across different societies. Now, we don't really have an answer to that. That's a question that's still very much out in the open. There's a lot of people studying things that might be related to that. But we know that there's a few things that are important. So the first one that we sort of start looking a little bit in the Atlas project is the structure of the economy seems to matter to some extent. As I've shown you just now, if we move along the income axis, we see a different sort of different relative weights of parenthood and marriage in terms of shaping this gender gap. It's particularly relevant for the child penalty. And what we do seem to find when we look across the world is that the child penalty is larger in societies that have shifted away from agriculture into more urban areas. So the thing that correlates the most strongly with the size of the child penalty is how urbanized an economy is, right? So this sort of is in line with the story of an urbanization, a shift away from agriculture also creates a separation between home and the workplace. And this separation then creates higher barriers for conciliating employment and the caring of children. Now, of course, that this could perfectly well be a burden that is shared equally by men and women, in which case the child penalty would be zero everywhere. So that explanation that is not enough to explain why is it that this burden is so unequally distributed, right? So to that we need to resort and we need to investigate other reasons that might be behind this inequality. For example, the role of gender norms, right? Gender norms are important in terms of shaping what people sort of think that the roles of men and women are, especially in terms of for example, working or, for example, caring for family members. They are also hard to measure. It's not something that you can easily get very precise information about. We try a little bit in the article that we wrote and that it's coming out in the LSE Public Policy Review by looking at answers that people gave to value surveys, and also by looking at this recent database collected by the World Bank on legal provisions for various sort of agency measures related to gender equality that was collected by the World Bank across a large number of countries. For example, things like, are there equal divorce laws for men and women? Are there equal asset ownership laws for men and women? Can women unilaterally request a divorce from their husbands without, and the state allows them to do that kind of legal provision? And this varies a lot across the world. And when we create sort of measures of gender norms in terms of their how conservative, how traditional they are, how unequal they are in terms of provision, not only like opinions about the roles of men and women, but also legal provisions for gender equality, we see that they correlate a lot with the marriage penalty, not so much with the child penalty, but with the marriage penalty. They seem to relate a lot to by how much does the event of marriage impact women's employment relative to men's employment. And I know that and that's something that like we're actively trying to pursue a little bit more to try to understand a little bit better what is it about gender norms and how are these norms formed and passed on. And the third avenue that I wanted to highlight here is policies, right? And I'm very happy that we have Dame Maria Miller today with us because we're going to be able to discuss that a lot more. But if we think that this is something that we want to deal with policies, what are these policies and how effective they are? And here, in my opinion, a little surprisingly, we also don't have a very clear answer as to what we should be doing to sort of tackling this issue if we sort of think that this is something we should be doing. Policies that we know that are important in terms of encouraging the employment of mothers are, for example, the expansion in the subsidies for childcare, the provision of adequate parental leave. I know that some of my colleagues in the panel have done also work on actions that are aimed at shifting gender norms, for example, exposing teenagers and kids to female leadership, to women who are in careers that are notoriously, that tend to be more male-dominated. All these are policies, are actions that we can take or governments can take to try and sort of provide more opportunities to sort of try to increase a little bit gender equality and perhaps decrease a little bit this very unequal burden sharing. And so we know from research that this can have a high impact on mothers' employment from a very large body of research. Here we are showing that it's also correlated quite a lot with the marriage penalty, with the impact of getting married on the employment of women relative to men. And I think there's a lot more of research that we can and should do, and hopefully will do, to sort of really be able to quantify the extent to which the child penalty, this unequal burden of care, can be reduced if we sort of do policies that are aiming at shifting people's values, people's norms, people's perceptions of gender roles, and also in terms of how much equality we embed in our policies, in childcare policies and parental leave policies. So that's all I had to show you for today. This is my email. If anyone wants to contact me, feel free to reach out. I'm going to pass on to Shani.
Thank you. I'm going to go through it for everything. So,
Okay.
yeah, thank you. Thank you. Extra slide. Thank you. Yeah, so. Yeah, fantastic. Well, I'm going to stand here, if that's okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to be part of this issue and to be here today. And I'm really excited to have responding from David Miller. Really interested in your comments. So this paper is a kind of a result of two projects I've been doing over the last few years. One, which I published as a book, which looks at motherhood and particularly at women who were in professional careers and left paid employment in the context of becoming mothers. And I've looked at very large data sets of media discourses and policy discourses and interviewed many of these women to think about the relationship between their lived experience and these discourses. And the second project, a very different project, but one that I'll show you in a minute, the similarities that struck me, is around menopause. Menopause, if you didn't notice, in this country has become a hot topic. And with a lot of particularly attention from political domain, celebrities, the medical domain, of course. And while these are very two different moments in women's life trajectories, what struck me is the similarity of both media and policy discourses, particularly around the fascinations with women who quit in these two contexts, women who leave paid employment. So we know that the general story of women's participation in the labor force is a story of success in OECD countries, UK included. You can see here the graph up to late 2024 from the 70s. And yet, while this is a story of success, there seems to be considerable attention given to women who quit, women who are not. And this is, I in no way suggesting that we shouldn't pay attention, but I want to kind of sensitize our awareness of what the issues are with this kind of a hype to an extent around women leave paid employment. So I want to take you very, very quickly through the kind of counter trend of women, in particular, these particular two moments, motherhood and menopause. And the reason I'm focusing is just simply because when you look at media coverage, when you look at policy discussions of women who leave paid employment, it seems to kind of hook very much on these two moments. And so what I've looked at, I've looked at dominant narratives around these two moments and how they're being framed. And I want to share very briefly the key similarities and then suggest some implications. So when it comes to motherhood, we know that mothers are twice as likely to leave paid employment compared to women who are not mothers. And COVID has exacerbated this trend in the UK as well as elsewhere. But what's important to note is that, of course, most mothers do return to the workplace, although crucially, a third of the mothers with children up to the age of 14 reduce their working hours quite significantly. But again, the majority do return and don't quit their jobs, and yet there has been considerable focus on women who have quit their jobs. This is a report that's been cited and recited in a lot of the media coverage. It was by the Fawcett Society in 2023. And what's striking is that you can see that the headline of the report, policy report, is state of the play, the number of working mothers is on the rise. Yeah, so generally it's a positive story. But it's this figure of 1 in 10 mothers who are quitting that seems to have kind of garnered a lot of attention. And I've looked at how this report has been then picked up in the media, and it was all around the 1 in 10 women leaving the workplace. Now, overall, when we look at mothers leaving the workplace, there's a much more kind of US type notion of opting out, although the framing is still prevalent in the UK, which means that there are certainly some references to the barriers and constraints that are imposed on women and force them or influence them to leave paid employment. But mother's decision is often still framed as a personal choice. You can see here a typical Daily Mail report about women leaving their, quitting their jobs to look after teenage kids, and of course they're being full of guilt and so on. And often the depiction is one of women making some kind of a rational, sensible decision because of impossible balancing of work-life balance, a desire to prioritize their kids' needs. We see it also in the often coverage of resignation of high-profile women like Jacinda Ardern, her famous empty tank. If you remember, she said that her tank was empty, and and in her resignation speech, she actually said, she addressed her daughter and she said, "Mommy is coming now," and this sense again of neglect and so on. And there's a class important issue here that I don't have time to speak to, but I just want to mention that while middle-class mothers and upper middle-class mothers, often their decision to leave paid employment is framed much more positively, yeah, as kind of a choice of quality parenting, yeah. With working-class mothers, we see a really consistent over 3 decades. We've done huge content analysis of 3 decades of denigration of working-class mothers, and that's been very much also the government line in terms of consistently being critical of working-class mothers and their quote-unquote choice to leave or not join paid employment. But whatever, either in the case of middle class and upper middle class or working class, again, there's a very consistent emphasis on it being a personal choice and a personal responsibility, far more than looking at the structural factors that are causing that, or at least influencing that. And with menopause, although women over 50 constitutes the fastest growing demographic in the UK, in the workforce, and the vast majority of menopausal women are actively participating in the workforce, there's been a huge preoccupation and a lot of coverage and discussion around the 1 in 10. Interestingly, very similar statistic. That's what I call sticky statistics. Yeah, it's kind of become a headline, and the 1 in 10 started rolling and getting a life of its own. And again, here it's interesting that it comes from another Fawcett Society report that was anyway based on very flimsy and wobbly methodology, and has been made then popularized in the Vina Nicole documentary that made a huge splash. But also these are just examples of many of the headlines. And it also made it to the new guidance on menopause in the workplace. It was issued last year by the Equality and Human Rights Commission. That's kind of cited there as a very important kind of justification for menopause policy, new menopause guidance in the workplace. Here, in relation to menopause, the discussion is perhaps slightly more nuanced. There's a discussion about women being compelled to quit because of lack of support. And yet, still here too, we see quite a significant focus on the decision to quit as a personal choice, yeah, as a personal choice to do with your inability to manage your symptoms or your body in the workplace. And you can see, for instance, even when in an example such as this BBC report, when you read it, it is a lot about these women's lack of energy, their fatigue, their desire to focus on their private lives, which again might be as well the case. But what I'm saying is that that's the consistent kind of trope and message. And you can also see as here that often the kind of most visible women in relation to the discussion are women in the professional sector. There's very little of any other women in other sectors. And so the structural factors that affect the decision tend to be quite minimized, if not completely erased. So I want to very briefly discuss a few implications that have some policy importance. First, it's really critical to identify the factors that are causing women in different moments of their life and professional trajectories to quit. That's important. And we need to understand them and to also perhaps predict in relation to them. What struck me, particularly in relation to menopause, but also to an extent in relation to motherhood, how very little reliable data there are, actually. If you look at the ONS, the Office for National Statistics, if you look at the Labour Force Survey, if you look at the main kind of the British Household Panel Study, the UK Household Longitudinal Study, all the major kind of databases, the word menopause does not appear there. And so there's lots of extrapolation that is very problematic in terms of what causes women to leave at this category of age. The second thing is, so it's almost a policy implication, partly would be just include the questions about menopause in these questionnaires, among other. The second is that really that's a much more problematic and or difficult and challenging one is shifting the narrative, shifting the focus from the one on employees' personal responsibility to what employers can do. And I've interviewed a lot of women, and it's striking and it's very painful actually to hear the stories of how women internalize the blame. Yeah. So when I interviewed women who left the workplace, they'd tell me about toxic work cultures, about unequal pay, gender pay gaps, and so on. And then they'd conclude and say, I wasn't good enough. I wasn't covered. Yeah. So there is a really significant process of internalizing the blame, and the narrative has a very important part to play here from organizations, from media, and so on. The third aspect is that the consistent linking of women's departure from the workforce to these two moments of reproduction, yeah, when women are in the height of reproductive cycle and, as it were, their decline, what it hides is something that is completely not biological, which is care responsibilities, which we know from ample research is a decisive factor in pushing women out of the workforce. And that's something that is really, again, being obscured by this focus on menopause and motherhood as biological processes rather than, and so here, of course, the huge call is to invest in serious commitment to provision of robust care. And by care, I'm referring again, not just to childcare, but of course also to elderly care for the vulnerable that women in later life, although interestingly, a very recent that hasn't made it into the article, but we looked at labor force survey kind of data across time, and care responsibilities seems to be a much more decisive factor than others in the workforce in 50 plus still. Yeah, so even older children in the home. The fourth implication is that while it's important to focus on those supposed 10% that leave the workforce, be it in the context of motherhood or menopause, there's 90% that are still in the workforce, yeah? And what's really important for these 90% is, as I mentioned, that a third of mothers and around 20% of menopausal women reduce their hours. And we know that the reduction of hours is a huge driver of the gender pay gap, yeah? And that just quantity-wise doesn't get as much coverage as the quitting aspect. The fifth aspect is that, as you could already even see from the glimpse of the even images that I showed you, the discussion about women who leave workforce centers heavily on women in two-income households, on women in professional jobs, yeah, kind of the leadership type photos. And it mostly ignores women in low-paid, informal, or insecure jobs, yeah. It largely ignores women who are not white, middle class, non-disabled, and it also very much ignores single mothers and single women in midlife, yeah. So this is a really important call for an intersectional approach that will be embedded into both media coverage and, of course, policy discourse to tailor it to individual circumstances and needs across patterns of different identity markers. And finally, I want to say, yes, there's a really clear economic goal in keeping women in the workplace. I don't want to argue that. And there's many advantages for us as women to stay in the workforce as long as we can. But I think what's really fundamental is that this is met or matched by an ethical commitment to protect and support women in the workforce and outside the workforce. And to remember that seems to be underlying these discourses an uncritical assumption that keeping aging women in paid employment is an unquestionable good. Whereas there's need, at least there's some early evidence, not just from the UK, that suggests that for certain women, particularly in poorly paid jobs, actually staying in the workforce later is detrimental to their health and to their well-being. So this is just to question this kind of unquestioned good of working until as long as you can. So on this note, I'd say if this woman or any other women quits, we have to understand better what's the dream about. Yeah, why do women, if at all, dream of quitting? and the structural factors underpinning these dreams or these actions rather than just the individualized, psychologized, and personal, which are important but are far from the whole story. Thank you.
Very much. And now we will need to move on.
So hi everyone, thank you very much everyone for coming and to Almudena for including our paper in this issue and for all the panelists for their great discussion so far. I'm also very much looking forward to the discussion after that. So our paper with Caroline Colli, with a researcher at the University of Barcelona, tackles the economic effects of sexual harassment in the workplace. So the study of sexual harassment first asks how do we define sexual harassment? So this is the translation from the French law definition. So sexual harassment is where any form of unwanted verbal, non-verbal, or physical conduct of a sexual nature occurs with the purpose or effect of violating the dignity of a person, particularly when creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, and offensive environment. So what this definition shows is that sexual harassment is, of course, about psychological and physical violence, and sexual harassment in the workplace means this in the context of work. And so why would we use economics? Why economic effect? Where this is coming from? And the definition of economics from the American Economic Association is economics can be defined in a few different ways. The study of scarcity, the study of how people use resources and response to incentive, or the study of decision making. So I'm not here to review about definition, just what the point that we want to make with in this paper is that what if sexual harassment played a role in understanding resource allocation and decision making in the workplace? And so that's how that's where the focus on sexual harassment started in the field of economics. And so how have economics addressed this issue so far? So what have they been doing? First, a large part of the work has been gathering reliable data and exposing the problem at scale. Of course, economists were not the first one to try this, but let's say it was a first step in uncovering other issue, and I'll talk a bit more about that. And I think this will bridge the gap, the talk with other panelists as well. The need for more data always. And then from the data that have been collected and the analysis that have been run, what have we been discovering? And here I will be quickly, and if you want more detail, the paper is available, but reviewing the expanding literature on this topic. And finally, what should we do? So from this exposure of the problem, part of the literature has focused on policy solution, again, bridging the gap, not the gap, bridging the bridge with other panelists. What do we do in terms of policy? How do we tackle this issue? And so we'll be exploring promising interventions from the literature and future research directions. So first, and again, my colleagues talked a bit about that, but why do we need data? Just in case it's not clear or it's not so obvious for everyone. I come from economics, and so data is gold, basically, but maybe it's not the case for everyone. So data allow us to accurately quantify the scale and magnitude of the problem, which allows us to raise awareness. So it's not, it's data help us make people understand why this is such an issue. Targeting policy, understanding where resources should be allocated the most and why, and assessing progress, monitoring if our policy work or not. However, in the case of sexual harassment, finding primary data sources is a big issue. The first thing you might think about is court data from justice ministries. And indeed, it has been used in some papers, especially the work of Adam Pressers in Sweden, but it's not available everywhere. Scandinavian countries are extremely good at having available administrative data, but it's not the case everywhere. But one of the reasons why, even if it exists, it's not really available, it's because of anonymity. Those are, of course, sensitive data. But finally, one of the main problems of those data is that they're necessarily incomplete, because we know that under sexual harassment, whether it is in the workplace or not, many cases go unreported and do not proceed to court. So these are data from a study in the US that shows that 99.8% of victims of sexual harassment never press charges. So what do we do with actually those court data from the justice ministries if they're actually really looking at a very specific number of cases? Of course, if we talk about harassment in the workplace, we might think about firm reporting. More and more firms have some sort of data collection process now around many different things, and especially HR issues. However, again, it's not just the case for all firms. So that means that, again, those are specific firms that might collect the data. They are also very sensitive for firms to disclose. Of course, no firms want to say that this happens or not. It can be detrimental. And again, they might be incomplete because, again, of underreporting. This is a study from France that shows that only 9 to 16% of victims reported the harassment case to a superior. So not even like actually not proceed going in a procedure, just reporting it to a superior. So that gives you again the extent of underreporting. And that's where the power of surveys comes in. And surveys have been used more and more, especially post Me Too, so 2018, as a way to quantify better the extent of sexual harassment in the workplace. I'm not going to go into all of it. Again, there are more details in the paper. In the paper, we discussed 3 cases, 3 countries that we know better, the US, the UK, and France. And we discussed a bit how, especially post Me Too, so since 2018, a lot of both governmental institutions, but also private initiatives has been implemented in order to quantify sexual harassment in the workplace in particular. And so key statistics from those data, there are many more that we could put out and give you, but those are just the one that we think represents the most the different calculation and the different data collection initiatives. So nearly 1 in 3 French women have been sexually harassed or assaulted at work following the legal definition. 29% of UK workers experienced workplace harassment in the past year, in 2020. 64% of women in the US reported workplace microaggression, which is different from the legal definition, an important difference to make, from the Lean initiative, which has yearly surveys on this. And while all of this, while most of this focus on women, we see that also men report sexual harassment. According to the Pew Research survey, 27% of American men reported harassment in the workplace. 14% of French men reported workplace violence as well. So now, from this, showing you, the first step was getting the data. What do we see in the data? Sexual harassment is a prevalent issue. It's in a lot of countries, in most countries, and in most contexts. Let's go back to the economic part and how sexual harassment has an impact, of course, on victims strongly, physical and psychological health mainly, but it also has economic impact. The first one is long-term career disruptions for victims. In a study in Sweden, using the court data and administrative data on work, wages, and career, the author have been able to find asymmetrical consequences for perpetrator to the detriment of the victims. So that means that following the harassment case, victims were actually suffering more in terms of wages and in terms of their career trajectory than perpetrators. Two studies, one in Norway and one in France, have shown that sexual harassment participates to occupational segregation. Occupational segregation is when women go in certain jobs, men go in others. And what we know from the literature on gender inequalities in general is that women select into occupations that are less well paid, with less career advantages, etc., etc. And actually, so those two papers show that even for women who enter those potential high-paying fields, those difficult industries, sexual harassment is one of the explanation for the reason why they left. So the sexual harassment deters women from male-dominated, high-paying workplace. And Batu and my co-author Caroline got according to the term double penalty, in the sense of they suffer from harassment, which leads them to leave their jobs for less well-paying occupation. And there is also evidence that even more like the step before actually being in the job and leaving the job is access to the labor market. One study showed that in India, fear of harassment and social stigma around harassment deters women from participating in the labor market, reducing labor force participation altogether. So now, as I said, we also looked at the literature that tried to highlight potential policy solution against sexual harassment. So first, there are government level policies. It's mainly about defining harassment, defining punishment, defining. It's around the legal system and laws to protect workers in case of sexual harassment. There are also organization level policies. So some firms have been trying to do something about it. So in France, for instance, there's the STOP initiative. So stop to daily sexism or ordinary sexism, sorry, which comes with a package of that all firms have to, if they sign the initiative package, they have to monitor sexual harassment, they have to put in places trainings, etc., etc. And indeed, there are private organizations now that offers more and more awareness and reporting training for firms, and those are getting more and more popular around the world. There are also individual level activism. In France, there is also the Mouvement Les Colleuses, who glued a message on the wall of Paris around those issues, and especially sexual violence in general. And of course, the Me Too movement on social media, which had an enormous impact on showing that this was a problem and putting the problem in the public debate for people to think about finance. However, those initiatives have limits. Government-led measures often emphasize punishment. That's what I say. It's more about the law, about what are the punishments for such crime, etc., rather than prevention. The voluntary nature of firms' intervention limit their reach, so it's to the company will to do it. If we don't force them, sometimes they don't. I mean, you know, if we don't force them, they don't necessarily do it. They don't see an economic incentive for it. They don't do it either. Ongoing activism seeks to expose and confront this issue directly, but may lack organizational power. So, you know, it's hard to see if this drives long-term changes in companies, as per the Me Too movement, for instance. Well, you know, we're still waiting for large change in companies. So overall, the lack of integrated strategy to transform organizational culture and social norms around gender relations are important. So few more potential solutions, First, before that, what does the research say about all those training indeed and those potential limitations? So in India, one paper by Kamini Sharma showed that awareness training for male students reduced harassment. However, only the extreme form, but also led to a decline in cross-gender relationships. So it can lead to unintended effects. And we still have to understand exactly how those awareness training work. Policing in public places. So again, in another paper, they implemented a kind of an RCT where they put more policing force in certain area of the city, and it also lead to a reduce several forms of harassment, but not milder forms of harassment, which persisted following the increased policing in public spaces. And all of this might link to another paper that showed that using a list experiment, especially in male-dominated industries, people, and especially men, tend to over-report non-sexist attitudes, so to say that they are not sexist, and inflate their support for diversity policy. However, the paper showed that this is kind of they say they want this, but they actually don't really care. It's more of a social desirability bias. So resistance to those to a large cultural change operates in a subtle way, and entrenched attitudes are hard to change. So the limits of those policy solutions have been enlightened in the literature, and we need more. We potentially need more research and policy ideas as well to tackle this issue. And our recent work with Almudena, as well as Carolyn, the co-author on this paper, and Paola Profeta with the University, Bocconi, tries to look at another approach, which is focusing on beliefs of bystanders directly, so tackling those entrenched beliefs, and especially for people that are around in the situation and might help in the situation. So we show that belief about harassment, so its prevalence, the cost for victims, do matters to explain willingness to help. And when we actually try to provide information to correct this misbelief, we find mixed effects. So we find some positive effects in terms of for people who were underestimating the extent of harassment. However, we also find some form of backlash effect by men, by some men, when we give them information about what to do in case of sexual harassment. And this, we still have to understand what's going on, but there might be here something to dig in terms of understanding how those beliefs operate and how those training that are done in a lot of places, in most companies now, can actually just not help, but even create more issues. So it suggests room for targeted information and targeted policies in general that targets people that have different type of belief about gender norms in general and sexual harassment more specifically. Key takeaway: sexual harassment is a prevalent and systemic issue. The data set available are recent, and harmonization efforts still need to be made, although initiatives are on the rise, but we need more data. That's basically what I'm trying to say. Policies and activism are moving in the right direction, but more insidious forms of harassment face subtle form of resistance, and there are actually heterogeneities in response to policy, so we need to dig more into who are the people that are responding positively to what type of policy, who are the ones that are not responding well to other types of policy, and how we can change that, and how we can go and bring those people back on our side, basically. And overall, transforming workplace culture and societal norms around gender seem to be the key, but there is more here to try to understand, and it's actually something that is very difficult to do, as my two colleagues also highlighted. So yeah, thank you very much for this. I'm happy to take questions later as well, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And it's an enormous pleasure to be able to respond to these documents. And I'm trying to not only respond, but also perhaps sow some seeds in your minds about other areas which really do back up the issues that our colleagues have raised today. Forgive me that I've written some things down because I didn't want to forget anything. And I'm going to just sort of go through a sort of a short context. A very specific example, because I think it's important to look at particular areas of industry, and then three issues which are very close to my heart and I wanted to share with you. So, I mean, I believe really strongly that giving every citizen the right to fulfill their full potential is a matter of social justice, but also, having studied economics here for 3 years, a plain economic choice and a political sort of necessity, especially at a time where in our country we've got really tricky issues about labour shortages in some areas. And I think the papers that we've heard about today make some really compelling cases about that. And whilst the media can frame the issue as women making a choice, something which I completely reject, not only as somebody who was a politician for 20 years, but also as a woman. When it comes to work, I think women aren't making a choice at all. They are facing tough barriers, which they have got to negotiate, and people negotiate them with different levels of success. And I was really interested to hear about Gabriel's work, and particularly recognise his analysis of the marriage penalty and the child penalty. But I think it was Shani's work that really spoke to me when you talked about almost like a fog being created by some of these reproductive issues that the media don't half like to talk about, instead of really trying to look at the much more structural issues around caring responsibilities. And Margot, of course, was talking about something which I have worked for a number of years with Zelda Perkins on, which is the issue of sexual harassment in the workplace and the very real penalty that women pay for that. And Zelda was at a meeting with me only last week, and she spoke movingly about the way in which her experience of sexual harassment had not just caused an issue at the time, but had scarred her career and that of her colleagues as well. And how we deal with that, I think, speaks to my real interest in whether or not politicians are focusing in on the right things. Because by focusing on women's level and quality of participation being a function of choice rather than a response to structural barriers means that policymakers start to prioritise very different areas. It allows also, I think, businesses and other employers to underutilise a large pool of labour that could be helping to fill some of the skills shortages that we're experiencing, often blamed on Brexit or the pandemic. I'll come on to explain what I mean by that in a moment, but I just wanted to point you to one very specific area where we're seeing structural barriers at play, which should be overcome by policy and are not being, because people are focusing on choice, which invariably in this country means childcare, rather than undoing some of the barriers which I think are stopping women going into certain sectors. The Public Accounts Committee did a report last year on the construction industry. And they pointed out that the construction industry needs 250,000 extra people by 2027 if we're going to do everything everybody wants to do in the building industry. Now, at the moment, only 15% of the construction industry in the UK is female. That's 340,000 women. A small increase in the number of women could really make a difference to actually trying to build all the buildings we need. And looking at it, you could say that women are choosing to go into construction, but the evidence is really clear. Although I hesitate because I have academics here who will probably tell me the evidence I'm using isn't as robust as it needs to be. But when we actually look at it, 60% of employers are not providing PPE, the sort of safety stuff that's designed for women. Now, I, as an MP, went onto construction sites all the time because you do, don't you, put a hard hat on, you go and have a photo taken. And that's great. But the jackets they give you don't fit because, you know, frankly, you know, you have 3 children, having a man's jacket on, it, you know, it's a bit tight around the top. You've got shoes that are 2 sizes too big. You've got harnesses that slip off. And if you look at the reports that have been done by safety agencies in the UK, they say this is a real risk. Now, we heard a little bit about it in the pandemic as well. the way that surgeons and nurses were wearing PPE that were designed for men, not for women. Now, I mean, there's also, of course, in the construction industry, issues around misogynistic attitudes, which absolutely do prevail, and also the lack of flexible working. But these issues are not about women making choices not going into the construction industry. This is about the construction industry not making the choice to attract women. And I think that that is a really interesting thing to reflect on and a very particular example. And I go back to the fact that with the focus on labour shortage in this country, we need to, there's never been a better moment, I don't think, for policymakers to be unleashing the power of women in our labour market, whether it's for by getting the right PPE in place or making sure that issues like sexual harassment or the way things are portrayed in the media or marriage and child penalties are actually taken seriously. Because the fact is that in this country, we have 6 million women who work part-time hours for a range of reasons. And I don't believe that all of those women are choosing to work part-time. They are potentially being forced to work part-time because of the nature of our workforce and our workplace in the UK. Too many women feel that the only option they have to do is to opt out or to change jobs. And the data does suggest that they're down trading those jobs at the same time. So when they face the child penalty, they face the marriage penalty, they're opting out of the labour market and going for something which potentially underutilises their skills. And I think one of the things that I'd be encouraging everybody to look at, and I don't think gets enough attention, is looking at the gender pay gap based on age. We're very good at looking at the gender pay gap in its totality and patting ourselves on the back to say how well we've done. But actually, if you look at the gender pay gap for women over the age of 40, you can see that marriage penalty and that child penalty writ large. And it doesn't, I don't believe it has to be that way. Now, the papers we are talking about today really underline the importance of addressing these structural issues. And I often don't think that politicians are doing that. They are perhaps reading the papers too much, not looking enough at the evidence. And Shani, I picked up a sentence that you wrote in your paper, that misreading the facts has significant consequences. And sometimes feel that that is a sentence that every minister should have on their wall, because we need policymakers to digest the correct diagnosis if they're going to respond with the right policies. And that's one of the reasons I helped to establish the Women and Equality Select Committee. Well, because I also was absolutely unhappy with the fact that there was a narrative that women were choosing to leave the workplace. It's clear they weren't. And also because of an oversimplification of the issues that women face. And also we found a huge problem with a lack of data. And I'll come on to something that I think all of you need to be doing in a moment. So over the last 10 years, I think we have made some progress. You can't deny the fact that we now have more childcare, more free childcare available, although some people don't know it. Foundations have been laid in flexible working, which you can see now coming through even more in the Workers' Rights Bill, which is good. Doors have been opened on parental leave, and I can tell you, because I was in the room when that policy was birthed, it's a very expensive thing to do, and it's very difficult for us to shift to where some other countries are at the moment. But at least our parental leave policy at the moment gives some employers the ability to go even further and do good things. But I think that women in 2025 really need policymakers to listen to what these guys are saying and to shift the policy focus away from just the notion that you're trying to create choice for women to be in the labour market or not be in the labour market, but actually to try and remove some of these really structural barriers which are stopping women participating, and hopefully in doing so, really encourage the media to talk about these issues in the right way as well. So 3 specific things just to think about. The day one right to flexible working, I think, is the best thing in the Workers' Rights Bill, because that gives women particularly the option to plan for a job that can fit around their other responsibilities. I actually had an initiative with Working Families, who are a brilliant charity, back in 2012, called Let's Talk Flexible Working, which you know, and all of these initiatives have worked up, I think, to this point where a day one right to flexible working, I think, will really be an enormous policy shift, and I think does demonstrate that ministers are really understanding the need to remove that barrier. But I do think that there is an opportunity for somebody, maybe in this room, to really help employers understand what that means. It isn't, because many employers have been burnt by the pandemic and the shift to totally remote working. They don't know how to manage that. And they see a day one right to flexible working as being a real threat to their businesses. They need to understand how that can actually not be a threat, but an opportunity. Removing a barrier, getting a big pool of labour interested in going into their business, it's an opportunity, not a threat. The second thing I think you all need to think about, and it's building on a number of comments that were made earlier around data. I think one of the main things I learned as 20 years of being an MP is look for the data that's not there, rather than the data that is there. And you will then start to find some interesting things. I'll give you an example. In 2016, the Equality and Human Rights Commission did a piece of research, which I'm going to ask them to do. 50,000 women a year left their jobs when they were pregnant. 50,000. Now, I've been pregnant 3 times. Actually, I did leave a job when I was pregnant with my final child because I wanted to. But leaving a job when you're pregnant, you are not going to get another job. You don't do that lightly. I would suggest you don't do that willingly. Thanks to the HRC, we now know that 50,000 women a year do this. But actually, there's not been any work done to understand why. And I would suggest to you that there's probably some very interesting reasons why women do that and why it isn't picked up in other areas. And that is the use of non-disclosure agreements, but I'll come on to those in a moment. Second thing in terms of data is, we've talked about the gender pay gap, looking at women over the age of 40. Nobody ever looks at the disaggregated data on gender pay gap. Please do. And then the final thing on looking for data where it isn't, and making sure you fill the gaps. It wasn't until 2020 that ONS removed the upper age limit on the data they collected on domestic abuse. Up until 2020, they only collected data on domestic abuse for people under the age of 74. When they removed that upper age limit, they found something quite shocking. They found that 400,000 older people had been victims of domestic abuse in the previous year in England alone. And nobody was providing a policy response to that because nobody knew it was happening. So look for where the gaps are and go and find out, and then give the policy people the opportunity to actually address the issues that are happening. But the third issue that I really think you need to think about following these 3 papers today, which I've mentioned already, is the use of non-disclosure agreements, because it is in no way are you going to be able to resolve the childhood penalty, the child penalty, the marriage penalty, tackle sexual abuse, sexual harassment at work, or indeed trying to surface all of these issues. If employers can use non-disclosure agreements to cover up wrongdoing in the workplace, it is really important that I believe that we need to address that and stop employers using them. Now, interestingly, the solicitors and lawyers, and I'm married to one who was studying here when I was here. It's a great place to meet your husband, by the way. And we've been married for many years. Solicitors are really getting their act around, together on it, and they are stopping allowing their clients using non-disclosure agreements in the wrong way. Why? Because they're a regulated profession, and if they do it wrong, they could get into trouble. But there are lots of other areas of the employment market which aren't regulated, and people are still trying to use non-disclosure agreements to cover up wrongdoing, and particularly in HR professions or HR departments. And I think until we make the use of non-disclosure agreements covering up wrongdoing, unallowable in law, we will continue to see this happen. Now, the argument in support of this is really clear. Universities. Michelle Donnellan, when she was Minister for Universities, put in place a ban on the use of non-disclosure agreements in universities, and it hasn't caused the end of the earth. It's just helped people to say no when they're asked to put in place those sorts of cover-ups that can happen when something not quite right happens in the workplace. So I would suggest that the government has unfortunately made a bit of a mistake, and I will be certainly working to try and get them to put a ban on the use of non-disclosure agreements into the Workers' Rights Bill when it's in the Lords, something I've long campaigned for, and I think it will help surface these issues, surface these sorts of structural barriers that we've been talking about, and make the workplace a truly equal place for everybody to prosper. Thank you.
Well, nice. So we have some time for questions. The presentations were really interesting and thought-provoking, so I'm hoping that there will be many questions. Just to remind you, please say your name and your department or affiliation. When you ask our speakers. Okay. Do we have any questions on time?
I'll go more with the reflection then.
Yeah, questions, reflections, comments,
Yeah.
everything.
I think questions will be born later at home, but more of a reflection that it seems like all the policies when they're working towards reproduction, it's like all nation making, encouraging women to go into this parenthood and taking time away and making choices. But when it comes in terms of welfare system, providing for these women to return back to work, it's all about individual choices. So kind of political, personal gets swapped around in the wrong way. And women are forced out of work rather than they choosing to. Since I've became a mother, I never returned to full employment. So my eldest is 21. I'm doing my master's at LSE and inequalities in social sciences. And this is the only time now I've got to breathe it out and take time for my studies, for my future career, at the age when my child is already doing masters too. So it kind of shows that we're doing something wrong. We're not thinking, we're not looking at those particular structural barriers. And I think, yeah, we should probably pay more attention to what causes women not to return back to full employment and being scattered all over, and actually de-skilling these skills. Like we are never in the same position as men. So we never can advantage our kind of career progression. We're constantly going backwards.
Anyone want to react to the comment? Or we have more questions? Oh, okay, so let's gather a few questions and then we'll.
Hi, my name is Magdalena and I'm studying the Master of Public Policy here. So thank you for your presentations, really insightful. And my question goes to Gabriel. So you mentioned that gender norms are really hard to measure, but at the same time, when we're talking about gender inequalities, we know that the root causes are coming from gender norms. So at some point, like, how can we think about policy making if it is difficult to measure, but at the same time, without data, we cannot provoke like changes there, especially when you're thinking about cultures that are really like resistant to gender equality or where traditional roles for women are so installed that it's really difficult to challenge those. So my question and like the reflection is like, in absence of this like strategic or clear ways to target, challenge, and change these gender norms, like what would be like your suggestions for policymakers?
one more question. And then-
Well, thank you. My name is Young-woo, and I'm currently doing Masters in Gender Policy and Inequalities. And I'm very interested in the ways in which we can use childcare and, those public services in order to ameliorate the care deficit or the care crisis. One of, I guess, main struggle that I'm currently facing in studying is that while there's an acknowledgement that there's a labor shortage, and then there's like huge crisis on that. But at the same time, policymakers are reluctant to provide more public welfare. And then sort of that leads to, for example, the child penalty, even if that then compromises the ability for labor shortage to be, mitigated. So I was wondering, where do you see these tension of the policy orientation is coming from, and potentially if there's a way to disentangle it? Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think we have some online.
There's a question by Jordana Luthra. They ask did they have a look at the satisfaction rates on women reducing hours or leaving work? What about childcare expenses can also affect leaving work or working less?
Okay, so we have a few questions about women leaving the workplace or labor force because of children. Some reflections about that being many years after children are born, right? So maybe Gabriel, somebody alluded to you, and then we have the speakers.
Great. No, that's a great question. Thank you. I think that's and that's one of the great questions that you say. It's a great question, partly because it's very hard to answer. And I think that yes, like it's gender norms are like a concept it's not even easy to define, let alone measure. And as you said, there are societies in which culturally it can be very difficult to get at the root of gender norms. There are surveys, people are asked about gender norms, the extent to which these surveys are articulate enough, and also these surveys are able to actually elicit gender norms in a way that's truthful and actually reflects that how society thinks about these things. It's hard to even come up with what kind of questions you want to ask in terms of gender norms. So I think that from a policy perspective, to some extent, we have to use what we have, even if it's imperfect. It's better than nothing. We have value surveys, we have a lot of like qualitative work, and I think especially in the world of economics, I think perhaps we underdo a little bit of qualitative work in terms of discussing and trying to understand in a more in-depth way, even if that comes at the expense of having sort of like a larger sample size. I think that there's also policies related to gender norms directly, in the sense that when we talk about policies that can impact things like the child penalty or sexual harassment in the workplace, there are policies that affect that directly in terms of like, I don't know, providing more childcare. But there's also the way in which those policies affect the norms themselves, right? So for example, if you have a society in which you have 6 months of paid leave for mothers and 1 week of paid leave for fathers, what's the kind of message you're giving, right? In terms of like, what is the norm in terms of caregiving for a child? So policies that impact norms will then sort of in some ways change the ways that these norms can be perceived. Not in the short term, you can't change. This might be deeply rooted cultural issues that might have been around for a long time. So I think this is more of like a long run issue. So I think that policy work that directly tries to sort of change a little bit the way that gender norms can be perceived with that goal of providing better equality are one sort of way that I think we should sort of like embrace in a way almost that the issue that gender norms are a challenge and try to like tackle it in a way. And if I may, I also want to like quickly discuss on the point that was raised online in terms of the role of childcare prices on mother's employment. It's a very big role. There's a lot of empirical research that shows that subsidizing childcare is important in terms of increasing the labor force participation of mothers. I do a lot of work in Brazil. There's a recent work that was sort of published about this policy in Brazil that made the school day longer, massive impact on working rates of mothers of kids of school age. So the prices and the availability of childcare, I think it's been documented in many different settings that are super important, and definitely one of the root causes of this paired with perhaps the gender norms of who should be doing the childcare, one of the reasons why we see this like inequality in
Maybe on this one, just to on the gender norms point, I think just to complement what you were saying, Gabrielle, I think where economics at least has been looking at now is psychology and looking at two different things, which is unconscious and conscious bias that creates the gender norms. So unconscious bias, for instance, there's the implicit association bias, which is basically, I mean, I see a lot of nodding, so maybe you've done it, developed by a psychologist in Harvard that has been used a lot. And for the conscious bias, the world value survey, which I think you also used in a paper, and where you ask explicitly, so you think that if there is a recession, women have less, should not have priority for jobs, for instance. So that's kind of conscious bias. That's how we measure gender norms now more and more in economics or when we use data, and those tests of association. So to look how this is used in quantitative in quantitative work. There is among many others, but the work of Michaela Carlona on teachers' bias, where she actually ran this association bias, the association implicit association bias test on teachers in Italy, and showed that this test affects performance of girls in math, for instance. And so that's how we can then directly link this to policy, which is, oh, okay, so maybe we need to train teachers on how not to be biased. So there are more and work, like it's really emerging, but I think here is the interesting like cross discipline type of work that happens of economics, psychology, sociology, and looking for more measures. So we're getting there. We're getting to the point where we can actually measure some stuff on gender norms and add them to understand labor force participation. Sorry.
Yeah, I'd like to make two brief comments. One is that I feel that too often when we talk about norms, there is this slightly fatalist approach of norms that are fixed and they're so big that we can't change them. And I think it's really crucial to take a historical perspective and recognize that norms change. And norms can, and there's role for policy, and I, as a media scholar, not just truly believe there's very clear research that shows that media narratives in popular media today, more and more on social media, play a decisive role in changing norms. It doesn't happen, in a fortnight, but it happens. So that's one thing I'd say, and the notion of norms is from what is normative, what is considered as it were normal and normalized. And this is something that is active work of construction, symbolic construction. So that's one thing I want to say. And the other thing is just about the questions that came online about women's satisfaction. One thing we do know about women working part-time is that women working part-time, it's anecdotal, but it's backed up by large scale research, is that they work part-time, but they do many more hours actually than what the contract shows. And this makes them very unsatisfied and unhappy and feel exploited and actually exploited. So there might be, again, some kind of myth about the, resonance of the happy housewives, but maybe from the 50s and the 60s into the happy part-time homemaker and worker. But in practice, there's, different layers of unhappiness that are not just about women being miserable because they're miserable, but because there are, again, structural issues that do disadvantage them quite significantly.
And can I just pick up on the point about childcare, because I think there's a lot of policy issues around childcare which get decided on based more on budgets than on reality. And one of the big issues around childcare in the UK, and I think it is different by country, is flexibility of childcare. It becomes very difficult and expensive to provide really flexible childcare, which reflects the way jobs exist nowadays. And in fact, I was talking to somebody only yesterday who was having to buy a full day's childcare, even though she was only working for half a day, because the provider that she went to didn't provide half-day sessions. Why? Because it was more expensive, and therefore the provider was only funded to provide full-day childcare in that area. It's also a bit of a postcode lottery. So understanding having budget there to provide childcare is great, and we have more budget than ever before to provide lots of free childcare. But if it's provided in packages that don't really meet the working needs of the individual, then there's a lot of waste that's in there. So I do think more work around how we get better provision of childcare. And of course, in the UK, it's always been a bit of a cottage industry, unlike places like the Scandinavian countries where childcare has grown out of primary school education. So most childcare provision is in a school setting, whereas in the UK, most childcare provision is not in a school setting, particularly for younger children. So the policies around that and how we use the money is actually quite difficult and complicated, not helped by a very fragmented cottage industry type sector.
Can I add something to what Shani said?
Just 1 minute, because we're over the time.
sorry.
5 more minutes, I'm so bad.
And just to very quickly talk a little bit, like you sort of highlight a little bit the thing you said about gender norms being changeable, and I think that's a super important point. And I want to sort of mention quickly a study that a few years ago in India. So in India, there was a rule that was passed for affirmative action of political representation in political leadership that mandated a certain number of municipalities to elect a women mayor. And which municipalities was elected a women mayor changed every election. So in one election, a certain group of municipalities had to elect a women mayor. The next election, there was a different set of municipalities. What they found was that not only when you had to elect a women mayor, you were much more likely to elect a women mayor, which is just a measure that the policy worked, but also municipalities that had to elect a women mayor were a lot more likely to elect another women mayor in the future elections when they were no longer mandated to do that, which I think tells us a lot about how exposure to to female leadership changes norms about how acceptable it is to have female leadership in politics.
Yeah, I think the literature is evolving in a way that we now recognize in economics. It's unlike media communications, that policy can actually change norms. And this is why it's so important, as you were saying. You mentioned flexibility, you mentioned, but there are some policies that reinforce those norms, like paternity leave that is unequal. It reinforces, not just that you're giving a signal, but you're actually reinforcing those norms. And this is something that recently we are beginning to get to terms with it. There is one more question there, and oh my God, okay. Are we okay to stay 10 more minutes?
Yes.
Feel free to leave if, okay, yeah. 10 more minutes.
Very much. I just have 2 questions. They're very, very specific. First of all, thank you so much for everything tonight. Gabriel, on yours, when you were talking about the child penalty and the residual gap, I was wondering how you normalized the score on the left-hand side. Was it a percentage based for unemployment, or was it normalized?
It was percentage based.
So if you, so the interpretation there is for low-income countries, 20% of women were out of work as a result of the gender gap. Is that correct?
No. So the gender gap, sorry, I thought you meant about the sort of like the country-wise, no,
yeah.
that is percentage point based. So
Sure.
on the left-hand side,
Gabriel,
it's percentage
because it's a
points. Yeah.
very
very
technical
specific.
question. Can you follow that up?
100%, yeah, both of them I'll talk about. Thank you very much.
Do you have another technical question or?
It was about, yeah, it's about the talk, so yeah.
So I think it's better to, for the sake of time. Thanks so much. Impressive.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Patricia. I'm also studying gender policy. I just wanted to firstly thank Dame Miller for pointing out that labor shortages can actually be addressed with addressing the structural barriers to that women face at work. Labor shortages are obviously something that is a very hot topic right now, but I've actually never heard women being addressed as the solution. It's always, I feel like, the conversation of migration, and it's actually something that I haven't even considered myself. So I do hope that maybe this is something that we can talk about more often. And I have a question more towards Margot. Your point on male or men's experience of sexual harassment at the workplace, I found quite shocking because the actual percentages that you showed were quite similar to women's experience of sexual harassment at the workplace. I was just curious if there was more data in terms of, for example, who were the perpetrators? Was it also gender-based or maybe more impacted by seniority? Yeah.
Thank you very much. That's an excellent point. And that's a very interesting point with missing data. Surprise. But it's so I didn't have a lot of time to talk about it, but those data that I showed are to be taken with a grain of salt in terms of what's the definition behind it. What do they ask? So for instance, the number for women requests for microaggression, which is very different from the legal definition, and people don't see it as such. So the numbers that I showed here, one is from a US survey that also does not have the same definition as the legal definition. The other one is the French one, which is the legal definition. So in general, in the survey, men do not experience sexual harassment as the same rate of women. The one big determinant of sexual harassment is still gender. Being a woman exposes you way more. However, men, what I was trying to point out to say is that indeed men do report some sexual harassment. And here, I wish I could say more, because indeed, we don't have a lot of, so we have the few data that we have on sexual harassment, which as I highlighted, are already scarce. It's even worse when we're talking about men experiencing some sexual harassment. So apart from anecdotal evidence, that are not really useful here, I cannot say much about that. So that's definitely open avenue for research to understand what's going on. Is there some, is it gender-based? Is it, it's hard to understand. The only evidence that we have is the paper in Norway that showed that in the case of Norway, it's minority-based. So if you're a gender minority in your workplace, that's where you're more likely to be harassed. So men are more likely to be harassed in places that are female dominated. Women are more likely to be harassed in places that are male dominated. Again, not to the same extent, but that's the only thing that we can kind of see. But it's in one context. It's a very nice study, a very nice paper by Volk and Rickner. It's one context and without much detail. It was not the focus on the paper per se. So that's everything I can say. But it's a great comment, and I wish I could say more information. I know my answer is actually well. That's all I can say. Thank you. Yes, just be mindful about definition behind those questions. Again, we say a bit more in the paper.
I think we need to end the event here. Thank you so much. To our speakers, and thank you so much to you for such interesting questions and time here today.